Well, Happy New Year, everybody, and The Atlantic might have to ban this article. This is by David Wallstreicher, and this is in their books section at The Atlantic. But it says here, rethinking the European conquest of Native Americans. And we've been told for the longest time that white Europeans came over here to wipe out all these Native American tribes, create this white European empire. So there's a new book out by Pekka Hamalainen. Article talks about this, and the last name is Hamalainen, who happens to be a professor of history at Oxford. I'll get to that here in a moment. But a picture emerges of a 4-century-long struggle for primacy among native power centers in North America. So the article starts out, when the term Indian appears in the Declaration of Independence, it is used to refer to savage outsiders employed by the British as a way of keeping the colonists down. And that's true. At the time, the British Crown was using these Native American tribes, and they knew of these tribes that were more violent than other tribes, because you had violent tribes fighting against other tribes that were peaceful tribes. So you had these conflicts between these tribes. But they were using these more violent tribes to suppress the colonists, what they considered the rebels. 11 years later, in the U.S. Constitution, the indigenous peoples of North America are presented differently as separate entities with which the federal government must negotiate. They also appear as insiders who are clearly within the borders of a new country, yet not be counted for purposes of representation. Well, the Atlantic gets it wrong here because when we were founded, we were actually founded as a confederation of states. It's Article 1 of the Articles of Confederation. The style of this confederacy shall be the United States. The Articles of Confederation, our first constitution. So we weren't really a nation. We were seen as a collection or confederation of states who had common interests, but felt that each state should be sovereign, independent, and was able to handle its own affairs. The same people are at once part of the oppression that justifies the need for independence, a rival for control of land, and a subjugated minority whose rights are ignored. For the Finnish scholar Pekka Hamalainen, this emphasis on what native people meant to white Americans misses an important factor: native power. And here's the rub, folks. The lore about Jamestown and Plymouth, Pocahontas and Squanto leads many Americans to think in terms of tragedy and eventually disappearance. But actually, indigenous people continued to control most of the interior continent long after they were outnumbered by the descendants of European and Africans. And I can attest to this because where I live, it's called the Sioux Empire. Are we using that to poke fun at Native Americans? No, because the Lakota Sioux are a major part of local culture. We honor that. So this is known as the Sioux Empire. Much more accurate is the picture Hamalainen paints in his new book, Indigenous Continent, a North American history that encompasses 400 years of wars that natives often, even mostly, won or did not lose decisively in the exceptional way that the pardon my pronunciation here, Powhatans and Pequots had by the 1640s. Out of these centuries of broader conflict with newcomers and one another, native peoples established decentralized hives of power and even new empires. In a previous book, The Comanche Empire, Hamalainen wrote of what he controversially referred to as reversed colonialism, which regarded the aggressive slaving equestrians of Greater Comanche area, an area covering much of the Southwest, as imperialistic in ways worth comparing to the French, English, Dutch, and Spanish in America. And all throughout human history, this has been the case, whether it was the ancient Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians. This idea of conquering land, divide, conquer, negotiate, creating borders. There was continued pushback from some scholars when Hamalainen extended the argument northward in his 2019 study, Lakota America. And that happens to be where I live, my neck of the woods, Lakota territory. The impact of his work, and this is in parentheses, among historians may be measured by his appointment as the Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford University. So this isn't some guy who's just out there with a book to make a couple of bucks here. This is a professor of history at Oxford, one of our most prestigious universities. What was most distinctive about these two previous books was that Hamillenian so convincingly explained the indigenous strategies for survival and even conquest. Instead of focusing on the microbes that decimated native populations, Hamillenian showed how the Comanche developed what he termed as politics of grass. A unique grassland ecosystem in the plains allowed them to cultivate huge herds of horses and gave the Comanche access to bison, which they parlayed into market dominance over peoples who could supply other goods they wanted, such as guns, preserved foods, and slaves for both trade and service as herders. And it's true that Native American tribes did own slaves. They were able to take their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears. Hamillenian treats native civilizations as politics, or politely, pardon my pronunciation, as politely as making war and alliances in indigenous continent. There is less emphasis than in the Comanche Empire on specific ecosystems and how they informed indigenous strategies. See, this is what happens when you do these videos in one take. So it's a lengthy article, folks. So, and if you've ever read The Atlantic and The New Yorker, they like to use these long sentences. Instead, he describes so many native nations and European settlements adapting to one another over such a wide and long time period, the readers can appreciate anew how their fates were intertwined, shattering the simple binary of Indians and settlers. Indigenous peoples adapted strenuously and seasonally to environments that remained under their control, but had to contend at the same time with Europeans and other refugees encroaching on their vague borders. These newcomers could become allies, candidate rivals, or victims. Hamillenian sees a larger pattern of often blundering Europeans becoming part of the indigenous systems of reciprocatory or exploitation, followed by violent resets. When Dutch or French traders were generous with their wares and did not make too many political demands, natives pulled them into their orbit. Spanish and later British colonists, by contrast, more often demanded obedience and control, actually he uses the word obedience, and control over land, leading to major conflicts such as the ones that engulfed the continent in the 1670s and 1680s during the 7 Years' War. These wars redirected European imperial projects, leading to the destruction of some nations and the migration and recombination of others, such as the westward movement of the Lakota that led to their powerful position in the Missouri River Valley, and later farther west. In this history, indigenous nomadic mobility becomes grand strategy. North America is a continent of migrants battling for position long before the so-called nation of immigrants. Quote, properly managed settlers and their goods, quote, could be useful. Hamillenian writes, the five nations of the Iroquois Confederacy establish a pattern. Oh, there's that word confederacy. So you mean to tell me that Native American tribes had a confederacy? Establish a pattern by turning tragic depopulation by epidemic into opportunities for what Hamillenian calls, quote-unquote, morning wars, attacking weakened tribes and gaining captives. They formed new alliances and capitalized on their geographic centrality between future supplying nations to the west and north, and French and Dutch and later English tool and gun suppliers to the east and south. Ooh, that's a long sentence. Hamillenian insists that their warfare was measured tactical, that their use of torture was political spectacle, and that their captives were actually adoptees that were switching of sides in wartime, and the Iroquois settling out of distant alien tribes, such as the Delaware, was a principal plasticity. This could almost be an expert on European history, talking about the Plantagenets, the Habsburgs, or Rome. Again, happens all throughout human history. Whether it's ancient Egypt, Rome, the Greeks, Native American tribes. And there's the rub. Hamillenian, a Northern European, feels comfortable applying the or Western genre of rise and fall of empires to Native America. But imperial history comes with more baggage. Hamiltonian seems certain that Comanche or other indigenous imperial power was different in nature from the European varieties, but is often seen as if indigenous people did many of the same things that European conquerors did. Whether the Iroquois had imperial moments, actually were an empire, or only played one for diplomatic advantage, is only part of the issue. Hamiltonian doesn't like the phrase settler colonialism. He worries that the current term of art for the particular Anglo land grabbing, eliminationist version of empire paints with too broad a brush. Perhaps it does, but so does his undefined concept of empire, which seems to play favorites at least as much as traditional European histories do. If an empire is an expanding, at least somewhat centralized polity that exploits the resources of other entities, then the Iroquois, Comanche, Lakota, and others may well qualify. But what if emphasizing the prowess of warriors and chiefs, even if he refers to them as soldiers and officials, paradoxically reinforces exoticizing stereotypes? There they go with all this fancy language in the Atlantic. Hamiltonian is so enthralled with the surprising power and adaptability of the tribes that he doesn't recognize the contradiction between his smallish, beautiful praise of decentralized indigenous cultures and his condescension towards Europeans huddling in their puny, river-hugging farms and towns. Hamiltonian notes that small native nations could be powerful too and decisive in wars. His savvy indigenous imperialist wisely prioritized their relationships, peaceful or not, with other natives using the British or French as suppliers of goods. Yet he praises them for the same resource exploitation and trade manipulation that appears capitalist and murderous when European imperialists do their version. But this is what has happened all throughout human history. In other words, he praises natives when they win for winning, who expanded over space, who won is the story, epic battles are the chapters, territory is means and end. And the wheel turns fast, followed by the rhetoric. When British people muscle out natives or seek to intimidate them as treaty parleys, they are haughty. At the same time, cannibalism and torture are ennobled as strategies when they empower natives. Native power as terror may help explain genocidal settler responses, but it makes natives who aren't just plain brave, including women, who have been producers of essential goods and makers of peace, fade away almost as quickly as they did in the old history. As readers, we gain a continental perspective, but strangely, we miss the forest for the battlefields. So this is a story at the Atlantic, lengthy article. I'll read part of this to you, or most of it. So go check out this article at the Atlantic talking about Pekka Hamiltonian's book, where he talks about this relationship between the Europeans and Native Americans, European conquest. But as you can tell here, and even the Atlantic admits, author of this article admits, that the history is a little more complex. And whether we're talking about the Romans or the Greeks or the Egyptians, the Spanish, European settlers, Native American tribes, it doesn't matter. Human history is what it is. It hasn't changed. And the same characteristics found in the European continent were the same characteristics that you find with Native American tribes. Because we all want to survive, right? And so this is the pattern of human history, as I mentioned. So if you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. You can also follow me at Instagram, #JasonComposes, or find me at Twitter, Culture Confederacy at Twitter. Thank you for letting me struggle through this. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you next time.